Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at old crimes in modern times. Crime since 1900, continuity. The previous video in this series looked at changes to crime in the 20th and 21st centuries. This one looks at how old crimes have adapted and changed for modern times. So let's get into it. There was tremendous social change in 20th century Britain, which has continued into the 21st century. Some new crimes have emerged, others disappeared, and some things that were crimes have been decriminalised. This all represents change, and I covered all this in the previous video in the series. However, there has been significant continuity, with old crimes changing and adapting to fit or take advantage of new developments in society and technology. Continuity doesn't have to be about things staying exactly the same. Often, it's about recognising similarity over time. Our first and most complex example is terrorism. The use of fear, the threat of violence, and the committing of atrocities to influence political ideas and actions is actually an old idea. Terrorists have always sought to recruit people sympathetic to their cause, planned their attacks in secret plots trying to outwit the authorities, and used fear of attacks, as well as the actual attacks themselves, as part of their tactics. This was true in the 1605 Gunpowder Plot, which sought to replace the UK government by blowing up the King and Parliament in a violent attack. It therefore fits most definitions of terrorism. In the 20th and 21st centuries, there were other terrorist threats. Perhaps the most famous is the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. They used violence and bombings in a campaign to effectively make Northern Ireland independent of the UK and united with the rest of Ireland. They were particularly active in the 1970s and 1980s during the Troubles. This is a massive simplification of a very complex case, but that is the gist. Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been responsible for more recent terrorist attacks internationally, including in Britain. The July 7th bombings of 2005, and you can see a picture of them there, was when suicide bombings on public transport in London killed 56 people and injured over 700 more. That's an example of modern Islamist terrorism. Another would be the attack on people at the Manchester Arena who were attending an Ariana Grande concert in 2017. Whereas the Gunpowder Plotters met in person or wrote letters, modern terrorists use the internet to communicate, plan and radicalise potential recruits. It is also used to publicise their atrocities and further spread fear. Defeating terrorism is tremendously difficult and not something that you're going to have to cover in much detail in this course. But an interesting point here is if you want to live in a free and democratic society, it's actually quite difficult to prevent all forms of terrorism. In order to have the sort of surveillance culture which would uncover these secret plots, you'd have to spy on your own people. So there's a difficult balancing act. In the wake of the July 7th bombings, Jonathan Evans, Director General of MI5, that's the internal intelligence organisation in the United Kingdom, said this of the bombings. The reality is that, while we will continue to do everything in our power to protect the UK public, we must be honest about what we can and cannot be prevented in a democratic society that values its freedom. Now, I'm old enough to remember these bombings. I'm even old enough to remember some people who were kind of caught up in them, though mercifully they were not very directly affected. But it did cause a certain amount of worry. I knew that I had a friend travelling across London at that time, and you know what? I was quite scared for her at the time. But then there's the other side to this. Speaking personally, I knew I had to travel across London exactly where the attacks had happened 2 days later. Sure enough, I was diverted. No problem. That's a minor inconvenience. But the atmosphere in London was really strange. It was quiet, much quieter than normal. Not because there were fewer people there, but just because everyone was a bit more tense and a bit more nervous. But the other thing I noticed was a real determination for people to just get on with their lives and not let the threat of terrorism stop them doing what they wanted to do. There was a real sense that actually the terrorists would fail if we continued to live our lives freely. Alright, you don't need those examples in order to pass your GCSEs, but it gives you a good idea of how terrorism can affect people. Let's hope that you are never directly affected. Another old crime in modern times is people trafficking. In the 19th century, criminals exploited poor girls and sold them into prostitution and forced sex work. Pretty disgusting stuff. In the 1830s, this crime was called white slavery, which obscured its true nature, but still reflected the idea of people being sold into forced work for little or no pay, which could happen in other industries as well. Today, this is known as people trafficking, and it can happen within countries as well as between countries. People from poorer countries can be brought to the UK and then exploited and made to work for little or no pay. They are effectively made into modern slaves. Criminals in the 19th century used kidnap, physical confinement and imprisonment, blackmail, threats and coercion to control and exploit their victims. It is no different today, with most of the same methods of exploitation used. That makes this an example of continuity. Perhaps a more surprising example of continuity relates to cybercrime, but computers didn't exist in the past, so what am I on about? Let's get into it. New technology helps us with everyday life in a huge number of ways, but unfortunately can also be used by criminals. Many old crimes now have modern equivalents using technologies like the internet. Take for example fraud. The crime of impersonating people or businesses in order to steal money is nothing new. However, it is increasingly done with scams over the phone or via phishing emails that trick people into giving their personal or financial details to criminals, who can then steal their money. There's also copyright theft. People have made copies of artwork without paying the artist for years. Before the internet, this included photocopying books and articles and making copies of cassettes and CDs for music. Today, illegal downloads and streaming of copyrighted music, video and games is hugely widespread, making copyright theft faster and simpler than in earlier times. Those of you who have seen my video on change will also know that this is an example of change too. So, the idea of stealing intellectual property is nothing new, but the methods of doing it are. Extortion. People have used threats of violence or embarrassment to blackmail people into handing over money for about as long as money has existed. Today, the internet allows criminals to threaten bigger groups all over the world, but by hacking businesses, email accounts, and by threatening to release harmful or embarrassing details about people. They demand money from their victims in return for not committing these crimes, holding them to ransom, which is, of course, in itself a crime. Our final points in summary. Modern times have brought criminals new ways of committing old crimes. New technology and developments in society have changed the methods and the opportunities for crime, but there are still similarities that show continuity. In 1605, the Gunpowder Plot sought to overthrow the government through an act of violence. It was plotted in secret and prepared to kill to achieve its aims. Modern terrorists like the IRA and Al-Qaeda also plot atrocities and commit acts of violence, which the authorities try and prevent. But today they are able to plot and publicise their actions online. In the 19th century, white slave traders exploited poor people to work for little or no pay. Modern people traffickers do the same thing, taking people from poor countries and forcing them into modern slavery. This can also happen within countries too. Fraud, copyright theft and extortion of money have long been crimes associated with blackmail and coercion. Today, cybercrime harnesses the power of the internet to extend the reach of criminals to ever more victims. So if you get a suspicious email, you know what to do. Be careful. Okay, that's the end of this video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks very much for watching, and be careful out there.